Hi, I'm Tal Becker. Welcome to the fourth in the Hartman Institute's webinar series looking at Israel's challenges from a Jewish values perspective. I'm joined today by Yehuda Kurtzer, President of the Shalom Hartman Institute North America, and by Yossi Klein, Halevi, a fellow here at the Hartman Institute. Our topic today is what we talk about when we talk about Iran. This isn't a conversation about Iran or the nuclear issue, not about sanctions or about the Straits of Hormuz. It's really a topic about how Jews talk about this issue between themselves, what it says about our relationship with one another, Jews in Israel and in North America. Yehuda recently wrote an interesting piece for the Hartman website, really quite a provocative piece, which said that there are broad gaps in how many American Jews feel about this issue and feel towards Israel on this issue, compared to the kind of anxieties and sentiments that Israelis have. And today we'd like to explore that a little bit more to try to understand each other a little bit better. So I'd like to start perhaps by asking you both to sketch out how it is you feel that Israelis, North American Jews really feel about this issue. And Yossi, I know this is dangerous, we don't want to generalize, and there are lots of differences, but could you try to channel a little bit some of the key feelings that there are on the Iranian issue, and particularly perhaps how Israelis feel about the US Jewish reaction to this? Are we disappointed?
I think we can make a few broad generalizations about Israeli attitudes toward the Iranian threat. First of all, the anxiety crosses left, right, secular, religious, all of our divides. And one finds a shared sense of anxiety that is fairly rare in Israeli society. There's a kind of emotional consensus here that the threat is acute and that Israel can't live with the threat of a nuclear Iran. And that's one piece of it. I think it's also important to say that Israelis are not walking around with this imminent sense of dread.
We don't have gas masks under our shoulders.
Not yet.
Not yet. Yeah.
But there is, I think, very much in the back of Israeli consciousness, the awareness that that scenario is probably coming. And I know, for example, that when I get invitations to speak from American Jewish communities, and they want to plan a year ahead. And for me, that really sums up the gap between how we perceive the Iranian threat and how the American Jewish community perceives it.
And do you think we're disappointed?
I can't make plans a year ahead because I keep thinking about, well, Elohim Gadol, who knows what's going to be in a year from now. And I think that Israelis who pay attention to diaspora-Israel relations, many of us are disappointed. And it's not so much a disappointment in terms of what American Jews are doing or not doing about Iran, because I think that realistically there isn't that much to do. In terms of a sense of urgency, of a shared sense of urgency, here I feel that American Jews, in a way, many American Jews, certainly not all, are hiding behind their geographical distance, and I think that there is an impaired sense of empathy here.
Yehuda, how do you feel about that? How do you read different segments of US Jewry on this issue?
Right.
Is Yossi right?
So as you say, it's hard to paint with completely broad strokes the American Jewish community, and certainly there are significant Jewish organizations like AIPAC and the AJC who have been talking extensively about Iran, broadcasting their anxiety and articulating a sense of responsibility towards and sharing in the same kind of anxiety that Yossi you're describing is common among the Israeli populace. I think the difference is that in the Jewish street in North America, if there is such a thing, it's less of a coffee table or Shabbat dinner conversation. And trying to understand that, and I feel personally less of that, even as a Jew who feels a deep sense of imo anochi betzara, that when the Jewish people are in crisis, I identify with it, and as a Jew who feels deeply connected to the state of Israel, it has not been, for me personally, a source of anxiety. So I've been trying to unpack why that's the case. I think one of the reasons for that is that for the American Jewish community, as for the American political community in general, this issue in particular feels very freighted by political and especially partisan political considerations. That the loudest voices in the American political conversation about this right now are the Republican candidates for presidential office, that for a lot of liberal political American Jews, or politically liberal American Jews rather, the ramp up in conversation around preemptive strike on Iran and wanting the administration to take a more active role sounds like the same kind of neoconservative ramp up to the war in Iraq. And there's a little bit of a, well, now that we're out of Iraq, what are we going to do with the, the military-industrial complex next? It's very hard to separate out the Netanyahu-Obama tensions that were played out in front of a Republican House from a year and a half ago, and to hear a lot of American Jews who were deeply incensed by the notion that they were going to be played as part of a political, as part of this political issue, that to me is clouding the seriousness of this as an existential threat.
Well, both of you seem to be talking about this idea that there's an anxiety gap. Israelis are anxious, and Yehuda, you seem to be referring to this kind of skepticism about that anxiety. Is it being manipulated? Is it genuine? And we use this term existential threat when we talk about Iran a lot. And I wanted to take a minute to look at that for a minute. Yossi, could I ask you, first of all, can you explain to me how you see that? Do you use that term? How do you see it? And Yehuda, what you mentioned now, I'd like you to address this, Yossi. What in your piece as well, do Israelis use this existential threat term too much? Have we become the boy who cried wolf? And that now that every time we say this, there's this reaction in US Jewry that says, well, maybe, but maybe you're just trying to, you're doing something else here. How do you feel about that?
Well, the first part of your question, I think that Israelis regard the existential threat with Iran very seriously and quite literally. And to unpack that for a moment, do Israelis believe that Iran is likely to launch a preemptive nuclear strike against Israel? I think most Israelis don't think so. On the other hand, policymakers that I've spoken to, very sober people, don't rule that out. They agree that it's a small chance, but the way that I heard this expressed from one of the people who I regard as one of my teachers on the Iranian threat, Ephraim Sneh, who was given the Iranian portfolio by Yitzhak Rabin in 1993, when Rabin put the Iranian threat on the table. The way he put it was, even if there is the smallest possibility of a preemptive nuclear strike, that Iran might actually use the bomb, then Jewish history compels me to put a stop to that threat. So that's one piece of it. Actually, the smaller piece. The much larger piece is I would say the atmospheric threat, the sense of the Middle East being permanently transformed, Israel losing the one absolute edge that it had in terms of its survival, guaranteeing its survival. A poll was taken not long ago asking Israelis whether they would consider leaving the country or whether they would want their children to leave if Iran got the bomb. 11% of Israelis said they would leave, and a much higher percentage said they would think of leaving. I don't believe the poll. I think that when it comes down to it, most of those people who said they would leave probably won't. But I think that points to a deep sense of a profound change, not just in Israel's strategic position, but a failure of Zionism. That Zionism promised the Jewish people a safe refuge. A nuclear bomb in the hands of this regime undermines the credibility of that promise.
And let me ask you, how does it make you feel when you hear this kind of sentiment that Yehuda is describing that says, well, the Israelis always say that there's some existential threat, and a kind of skepticism about it? What does that do to the relationship between you?
I mean, it's interesting. I was once at a seminar where someone presented a paper outlining 7 existential threats that Israel faces. Right. And I personally agree with at least 5 out of those 7 as legitimately defined existential threats. On the other hand, I recognize that certainly the way our internal conversations are amplified abroad could undermine our credibility. The question, I think, really goes to the heart of the basic health of our relationship. American Jews, my expectation of this relationship is that American Jews would be able to know when it's real, and when almost every Israeli of whatever political persuasion, and Yehuda, when you talk about this as a Democratic Republican break, it's important for Israelis to hear that, but that is so much not the way the debate is happening here. This really is not a left-right debate here. And people come out of all kinds of places on the map on this issue. And I think in that sense it's a much healthier relationship that we have toward and an expression of just how real the threat is taken. But that's my disappointment in American Jews, is that even if we do cry wolf occasionally, one expects that this is it, and I don't like Holocaust language, I don't like the 30s analogy, but it doesn't have to be the Holocaust to be an existential threat.
Yehuda, Yossi wants you just to trust him, right? He wants you just to take his word when he says it. And even if the last time he said it, it worked out okay, and it wasn't. Right. He still wants you to take his word for it. And, this touches on something you wrote, which was really quite provocative, that in some areas maybe, it's almost as if there's a fundraising need, and so you create the crisis, not a crisis so that you create the fundraising need. Mm-hmm. And are we manufacturing, and what does he owe you? Yeah. So that you take him seriously.
Well, this goes to the heart of the issue here, and I think we'll talk about this further on, but when you say, Yossi, we need you to really hear us in this moment, part of my initial reaction is, well, you need to figure out how to tell us that. And it goes to this whole crying wolf phenomenon. When I describe that the American Jewish community, in connection with Israeli interests, oftentimes plays up this language of existential threat for fundraising interests, I think it's provocative, but I also think it's empirically true. I've seen this in conversations with Jewish community heads who say, look, we know that when we talk to Jews in their 20s and 30s, that this language of existential threat doesn't appeal to them, right? That's part of the wave that elected Obama, was this, yes, we can hope, with, that in an Edgar Bronfman's book, Hope Not Fear, right?
Yes, we can overcome existential threat, doesn't it?
Well, exactly, right. And so there is a persistence in certain sectors of Jewish leadership in the American Jewish community to say, as long as there is still the dominant money in the Jewish community is Jews in their 70s and 80s who have lived off of existential threat through the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, and onward, we have to continue talking that language because it's what animates involvement philanthropically in Jewish causes. The best examples of this the last couple of years were the volume of email I got from Jewish organizations in the wake of bombings in Sderot, and more dramatically in the build-up to the unilateral declaration of independence by the Palestinians, which, if you had listened to the rhetoric from these mainstream Jewish organizations, it was this is the devastating catastrophe that's going to bring about the end of the state of Israel, and therefore support not the state of Israel, but me, right? My Jewish organization that's animating Jewish support for one particular political lens.
And I'll let you go on. Yeah. I just want to say, you talk about this as, in the end, having this kind of negative effect. It produces this kind of fatigue. Mm-hmm. When everything about the relationship boils down to what is the crisis of the day, and can you help me? Everything becomes very thin, and then people become weary of it.
That's right.
Something we talk about a lot here at Hartman. How do you deal with that fatigue?
Right. Well, it's hard. It's then hard to sort through when there really is a real threat, or when is it really real? And that goes to the heart of what we're trying to talk about: is how do we speak in a language that we can hear each other, rather than a language that that is constantly attempting to get one side to do something different. Another piece of this, you didn't use this analogy, but we've talked about this before, of it's May 1967, and you hear that in other places, right?
I actually
you use that language, right? And great.
I say it's a protracted May 67.
Right. So in May, and what that attempts to channel is that moment of anxiety of May 1967, the digging of mass graves in public parks, the anticipation of catastrophe, but. Of course, the irony of using the example of May 1967 is that June 1967 was a dramatic Israeli victory. And without being historically inaccurate, it makes that anxiety look foolish. Right? Because if Israel's capacity was so dramatic that it was able to achieve a military victory on 3 fronts in 6 days, then perhaps the anxiety was overplayed. And so it goes to the whole question of what Zionism is. And so ironically, if American Jews feel basically confident that at the end of the day, Israel will pull through, and that this existential threat is not so bad, not just because the facts in Iran aren't so bad, but because we actually believe in the State of Israel and the American-Israel alliance, which I think basically because American Jews are Americans, and there's a broad political consensus that believes in the American-Israel alliance, then it's ironically a Zionist position to not be so anxious about these existential threats.
It's interesting because what he's saying, as I understand it, is that could it be that US Jews believe in Israel more than Israeli Jews? In other words, we believe in our capacity to overcome these crises more than Israeli Jews do, and that's what's at issue. I mean, you have, what I hear from you is this sense that American Jews, or some of them at least, are more skeptical. They feel the distance. And in essence, their sentiments about their values and so on are such that your life is less important to them than this kind of comfortable existence. Yehuda's saying something else entirely. He's saying, I believe in you guys.
Right.
I from the distance can be less alarmist than you and see what your true capacities are.
I think that Yehuda, the flaw in the May-June 67 analogy is that the reason that June happened is because the Jewish people, both in Israel and around the world, were totally mobilized in May 67. I came of age in terms of, as an American Jew, in terms of my relationship to Israel in May 67. And that's all Jews were talking about in America in May 67. And certainly Israeli society was so totally mobilized that it was in direct response to the perception of existential threat, which is virtually missing, certainly in terms of the American Jewish-Israeli relationship today, and that's what worries me. Because I do believe this is an existential moment.
I would just say from a rhetorical standpoint, what you're really saying is this is not May 1967, this is September 1973. Where Israel was on the verge of a catastrophic condition that nobody was sufficiently paying attention to. The difference is that if the Israeli government is in a situation of preparedness now, like May 1967, as opposed to September 1973, at least the Jewish community is not mobilized around that anxiety.
The difference is just that Israelis are somewhat emotionally mobilized, where part of us is ready for whatever is coming, and American Jews, by and large, are not.
I'm glad that neither of you are saying that it's 1939, which has been part of the discourse to make it sound such as a crisis, but we don't even have the capacity to respond to. Right? 1939 was a moment where we didn't have a sovereign state. The question, in a way, is what are the capacities of the sovereign state to deal with this threat? That's part of it. And one of the things I'm hearing in the conversation between you, which is interesting, is almost in some respects, there are more diaspora-sounding words coming out of you from Israel than coming out of you from America. It's the Jews in Israel that are feeling isolated and under a hostile environment. It's the Jews of Israel that are worried about the precariousness of their existence. It's as if there is, in some aspects, we're more of a diaspora. It's the Jews in America that are comfortable and at home and having a kind of renaissance. And doesn't that just turn Zionism on its head?
It does if you're only looking at one half of the equation. And that is, yes, at this particular moment in Jewish history, the most endangered Jewish community in the world is the State of Israel. But the other half of that is that we are the only Jewish community that's able to cope with an existential threat. And that is the preemptive moment of June 67.
But the message, if I can interrupt you, the message I think that some American Jews hear is not that you're able to cope, it's just that there's the threat.
But if you listen to what Israelis have been saying, certainly we're getting this from the Israeli government, we're getting it from policymakers, we're speaking about the preemptive option on the table. Right. Why is the international community in such a tizzy about Iran? At least partly because of its fear of a preemptive Israeli strike. Now that's the Zionist component in this. Do I wish that the world had changed sufficiently with the rebirth of Jewish sovereignty so that we would not be facing existential threat? Yes. But given the fact that existential threat persists, the fact that I'm able to cope with it is the victory of Zionism.
Right, and Yehuda, I want to go back to your piece because you say something there that's really, was at least for me, quite shocking to read, and that was this idea that anti-Semitism is a bigger deal in Israel than it is in the US. You know, it's not just the nuclear issue, it's the nuclear issue in the hands of a regime that denies the Holocaust, that talks about wiping Israel off the map, that is deeply anti-Semitic in its rhetoric and its approaches across the board. And you kind of describe something that it's Israelis that really care about that anti-Semitism. Right. Could you explain that a bit?
Well, look, I want to draw a problematic analogy to the other existential threat language that the American Jewish establishment uses all the time, which is around intermarriage and assimilation, where there is also a generational gap and a cultural gap between more and more Jews who feel as though intermarriage and assimilation are realities of the American Jewish community, and in many cases a signal of American Jewish success, much more than they are a signal of existential threat to Jewish life. That if the daughter of a president of the United States, followed by the niece of a president of the United States, followed by the daughter of a vice president of the United States, are marrying Jews in explicitly Jewish ways, that the condition of the Jews in America is actually quite good, or it's like we've made it. So that when periodic bouts of anti-Semitism plague the American Jewish community, so this past week when synagogues got vandalized in Bergen County with a swastika, those are, it's hard for me to feel like, oh my God, the threat is really coming, when it's a more and more Jewish country in a deep way. And I think that's a big piece of why it's also hard to mobilize and motivate around this language of existential threat. For Israelis, in contrast, anti-Semitism, if we're going to use that language, is deeply rooted in the whole, one country surrounded by countries that hate us. It's tied into all of the mechanics of sovereignty. There's a growing cultural gap between the American Jews and Israeli Jews in how much hatred of the other motivates a meaningful self-identity. It's just less and less.
Ahmadinejad is not threatening us with intermarriage.
Right, but that's the whole thing. It's that whole. In some ways, I have to think about this, but in some ways, it's like diaspora Jews have figured out how to live compatibly alongside people who hate us. Israeli Jews, because the people who hate you are living not alongside of you, but on other sides of the borders. Therefore, the sovereignty raises the stakes of the consequences of that hatred.
I think Israeli Jews might want to, and this goes back to Yossi's point, they might want to remind you, well, we have the capacity to deal with that, and you're enjoying this wonderful period, but we as a people know that we need that capacity. We always need that capacity. And it makes me, this discussion makes me want to put you in a kind of hypothetical scenario. Let's imagine, if needed, that there is a hypothetical military action against Iran.
An Israeli
action, yes. Mm-hmm. The day after that, do you see the American Jewish world and Israeli Jews splitting because of this lack of belief? Oh, again, again you're going to war again, when that wasn't the only option, or is it a moment of unity?
I was speaking to a rabbi from the U.S. about this, a prominent community figure who said to me that his great fear, and this is the first time he's ever thought that this is possible, is that Israel could find itself under attack. The Israeli home front could find itself under severe attack, and many American Jews might simply opt out emotionally and say, well, you brought this on yourselves and don't expect me to bail you out. Now, that I don't know how realistic that scenario is, and I would really like to hear your response to that. But that is what's ringing in my head.
Well,
so,
Yehuda, do you think?
Yeah, I guess, and again, this is this funny place of my somewhat perhaps naive and optimistic Zionism as an American Jew, is that what I see is a broad American political consensus that is pro-Israel very deeply, and that goes on Republican and Democratic side alike, and it partly actually mocks the extent to which Israel features so heavily in the Republican debates, because at the end of the day, you're talking about the 90% American political consensus that is very pro-Israel, sees Israel as its primary strategic ally in the Middle East, and is very invested in long-term relationship through both financial, military aid, and so on. And that push comes to shove, whether it's an Israeli-initiated attack that would put the administration in a tricky public place, but privately, I suspect, under the table, America stands with Israel in a moment like that, or certainly if Israel is the subject of an attack, you would see American Jews supporting Israel the same way that Americans support Israel.
And what if the American administration would oppose Israel at that moment?
So I don't think that happens. You're asking about a hypothetical situation which I think requires a total shattering of an American political reality, and that I think here's the issue. I think Israelis see that possibility in the American political establishment more than American Jews do.
I tell you,
and that might be a fear.
Absolutely.
That might be the whole fear here, that we actually basically believe in our elected leaders, even if Israelis don't like them, and American Jews basically feel that that's not really a source of concern.
Let me say, in a scenario where things don't go well, things become complicated, the conflict becomes, it takes months, and perhaps there's Lebanon becomes involved, and there have been moments where administrations have said, this is going to end, whereas the Israeli government has a different approach to how to see the conflict through. At that moment, I think your optimism breaks down a little, doesn't it?
Yeah, it could. And what that suggests to me is a hope that the Israeli political establishment and that the Israeli street sees the need for a less confrontational and a more strategic orientation towards whichever American political administration is in place. In other words, if you're creating this dichotomous approach of we fear what you're going to do, you give yourself less tools towards actually building a sympathetic process.
I want to close by pushing both of you a little bit. Yossi, I want to ask you first, can you tell me some aspects that you understand, you're sympathetic to where American Jews are on this issue, and some areas where you expect them to understand you better or to do more?
Well, I think that what Israelis need to understand, and I certainly include myself here, is that the experience of American Jews over the last decade as Americans has been drastically different from our experience here. What American Jews have gone through is, beginning with 9/11, Afghanistan and Iraq, so that they are looking at Iran through the prism of these two wars, one of which one can argue has perhaps already failed, and the second may be on its way to failure. We are looking at a totally different reality, and we've experienced this last decade in a totally different way.
So you understand where they're coming from in terms of their fear of confrontation?
Yeah, I think we need to listen more deeply to their American experience.
Right.
I think that's what we're missing, and that's what I'm hearing from you, Yehuda. What I would like you to understand about us is the mirror image of that, which is what this last decade has been like for us. Beginning with the end of the peace process, moving from suicide bombings to missiles on the north to missiles on the south, and in a sense seeing the Iranian threat as the culminating process of what I regard as a 10-year jihadist war against Israel.
But it has come also with reasonable Israeli prosperity and Israeli capacity to, if not overwhelmingly triumph, to deal with those threats.
So here's the thing, there was this outrageous cover story in Time magazine recently about how Israelis don't care about peace anymore because we feel we're living happily ever after. That is the kind of misreading that only someone who knows nothing about Israelis, who doesn't understand what it means to have children in the army, could make. It's the mistake of someone who is not family. And my expectation, this is the other side of your question, is that an American Jew would not be capable of writing that kind of ludicrous story about Israel.
Because it's family.
Because it's family. That you will understand intuitively, you'll understand something about what we're going through emotionally, even if we're not explaining ourselves in the best way possible. And I always hear this from American Jews. Why don't you explain yourselves better? Our expectation is that family doesn't need the same kind of explanation that outsiders do.
Yehuda, what do you say to that? How do you, what do you understand about the Israeli predicament, where Israelis are, perhaps what you expect of them? And also to refer to Yossi's point, I mean, is it a fair expectation that since we're a family, that you shouldn't have explanations? You should just go with your gut.
Let me, I'm going to start with the second, and I want to give an outrageous example that I'm not, just to be clear, I'm not holding either of you to. But you know that this episode that took place last week with this Atlanta Jewish newspaper, where the editor-publisher, who since was booted out and has to sell the paper because he's under so much scrutiny, speculated aloud that the best Israeli options, the best of the Israeli options to deal with the Iran problem is to take out an American president. And I'm calling attention to it because those of us who hear hysteria that come from Israel, a part of that fear is, are you asking us to be not American, anti-American? Are you asking us to move out of a deep feature of American Jewish identity, which is our playing within the American political establishment? And again, I don't think that he was representative of Israeli views, but I think he is the extreme articulation of an Israeli view that actually wants to challenge the whole notion of American Jewish soft power, which has been the ability to support Israel via the political process and in a non-combative way. And what I really genuinely am hoping for out of the Israeli Jewish understanding of the American Jewish community is to have that kind of deeper sense of what American Jews are, to not think of American Jews as a subordinate population that at the end of the day needs to articulate a kind of loyalty to Israel that violates the loyalty to the American political establishment, but actually respects the norms of that and tries to work within it. The flip side, and our conversations have helped me enormously around this, that push of when I'm telling you something, you really actually have to hear it, is I think a very important thing for American Jews to start hearing, and I think a motivator towards creating the infrastructure of a conversation in which we can actually be better heard. I just feel, because of the overload of the history of existential crisis, and because, as we said, there is this growing sense that these communities are diverging, just playing by different rules, as I said, I think it is harder and harder to hear the stuff that you're talking about, which is this Iran thing transcends political boundaries here in Israel. And you, American Jews, need to be able to understand that this is not about just that political partisan orientation, but is actually about our deep existential condition.
I'm hearing both of you essentially saying that if this is going to be a partnership, and if this is a conversation in the family, we need to understand, I would say Israeli Jews need to understand that American Jews are not just Jews, they're also Americans. And American Jews need to understand that Israeli Jews are not just Jews, they're also Israelis. And we come to this family, it's an extended family, with those additional identities and experiences. And we have to see that in order to be able to have that partnership. And I think that, in the next year, the Iranian issue is going to loom very large for in the global conversation, certainly in the Jewish conversation. And I think we need to take a step back and make sure that we don't just talk about the centrifuges and the nuclear weapons. We also make sure that whatever crisis, whatever threat we're dealing with, whatever issue we're dealing with in the Jewish world, we deal with it in a way that brings us closer together and helps us appreciate one another more, and not in a way that pulls us apart on different trajectories. And the Iranian issue has the potential both to bring us closer, but if we don't manage it well enough, potentially to tear us apart. And I want to thank Yehuda and Yossi for your insights and kind of creating a way of talking about this issue that helps us understand each other much better. And I hope it'll be a model of the kind of conversations we can develop for the Jewish world in the future. Please join us for our next webinar on March 12th and join me in thanking Yehuda and Yossi for a really interesting conversation. Thank you very much.